So today's guest on Keen in Yoga is Doctor or Professor, or both, Chris Chapple. I'm not sure exactly how that lands. And he's from Loyola, Marymount University, I think, in Los Angeles. So he's here today to talk about, let's say, the Sanatana Dharma and ecology, or environmentalism, and how it relates to what we might call Vedic thinking, or Hinduism in common parlance. Thanks, Chris, for coming on.
Thank you. Good to be in your presence.
Thanks for coming on. So I suppose the obvious leading question is, do we find arguments suggesting any kind of environmental or nature ethics within the orthodox texts, such as Patanjali's or the Gita, or any text that people might know? It seems often that because of the view that material prakriti is essentially a slightly pejorative view, let's say, of material nature, and transcendental names of Indian thinking, that environmental ideas have often been pushed to the side but not concentrated on, whereas I was reflecting before the interview, in some respects within the origins or roots of Western thinking in ancient Greece, you have the belief of the harmony of nature being imperative, and that nature, is to be, Aristotle looks at nature for understanding, whereas I don't immediately see the gunas are to be looked at for self-understanding. In fact, they're kind of to be transcended, right? So, but having read your work, it seems that there is actually an argument for this environmental concern within traditional Vedic thinking.
When we think of the Vedas, we're taking a tour through history. And the Vedas arguably are the most ancient, continuous relic, if you will, that we have, that has been continuously transmitted from arguably at least 3,500 years. And these hymns give us a glimpse into not only a pre-modern worldview, but a pre-classical worldview. And as we examine, for instance, the Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda, we get a sense of human cosmic connection, human societal connection, wherein the human body itself reflects the structures of the universe and the structures of society. So rather than seeing any shade or ill judgment cast upon the material world, quite the opposite. There's truly a celebration of Bhur, of earth and water as part of the grand pageant of creation, but also present within the functions and the functionality of the lower zones of the human body.
Mm-hmm.
We see fire and earth, the Bhu, rather the Bhuva zone, contained within the human torso and abdomen. And then the grandeur of possibility, the grandeur of creative space, the Swaha, is within this zone of the body. And it's said that the one eye is the sun and the other eye is no less than the moon. Number one. Number two, hymn after hymn lifts up and glorifies the earth, Mother Prithvi, gives praise to fluidity in the waters. And in fact, the most frequently invoked deity within the Rig Veda, the oldest of human continuously transmitted documents, is Agni, is fire itself. and the ritual life of India, whether the humblest farm worker or the most elegant, refined Delhiite, everyone begins the day with kindling a household flame and acknowledging the rising of the all-powerful sun. Breath, vayu. Again, such wonderful passages in the Rig Veda about the marvelous Maruts, the marvelous wind gods that sort of define and refine, make possible the coming of the life-giving monsoon. And all of this within moments of sacred space that later become instantiated in rituals called yajna, through which we rekindle our connections with the world. And then even later, and these yajnas, these ritual performances or sacrifices become the provenance of the Brahmins, who also are the creators and the rememberers and the purveyors of these Vedic chants. And then all of this becomes, in later times, accessible to everyone through the daily process of what's called puja. And with puja, there is the kindling of the flame, the lighting of the incense, the adorning, even with one simple flower, but the presence of flowers, invoking the great gods within the human body of the senses. All of this construed, again, Behur, a little bit parallel or directly parallel to what we call tamas. The bhuva, that place of activity, rajas, and then swa, the place of the sublime, our connection with the divine. So no, the material world is to be honored and celebrated. It is the gateway to a sense of connectivity. And sadly, what the missionaries did when they disdainfully deigned to translate these materials, they came up with a set of tropes to denigrate the indigenous lifeways of India. And one of those tropes are that, they don't care about material, it's all illusion, it doesn't matter. And in fact, the on-the-ground experience of India is quite the reverse.
Well, thanks for setting me right there. I'm pleased to hear. I mean, unfortunately, obviously, it hasn't translated necessarily on the ground when one goes to India, as it doesn't necessarily translate here either. But I think we'll come back to that.
But let's back up with that for just a second. And on the one hand, and I'll just share a little bit of a personal story. For 12 years, I studied at Yoga Anand Ashram on the South Shore of Long Island with a woman who came from Calcutta and had done some medical training and established this ashram to share with young people, such as in those days myself and about, maybe 100 others. And this is in the very early 70s. And she put it this way. One day we were going off for our annual picnic at Belmont Lake State Park, and our setup team had determined that, there's a big sewage project, and it's going to not be okay. And she said, sewage? Well, sewage, that's the smell of life. And we had a grand day playing volleyball and running around. And when I later traveled to India, and I was confronted with those amazing smells and just seeing every aspect of life right out there in the open, the cows and the goats and the elephants and the street, everybody working. I got a sense that, oh yeah, this is the nitty gritty that we've sort of managed to pave over in places like America and the developed world. But there's an intimacy with all aspects of life that at first can be shocking. And but also can be inspiring, all the way to the point of the sadhu, that person who becomes committed to what we may in fancy words call voluntary simplicity. But where is the true happiness found? It's found in the bare essentials of that relationship, the human body, the senses, connecting with the five great elements, the pancha mahabhutas.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, yet again, to take the other side again, I mean, when we're practicing yoga currently, generally in the the global West, and within India as well now, the way it's translated, there's not necessarily any injunctions to use this practice for I mean, we've got environmentalism and current interest in that, right? And how can we make a connection to the thoughts of Patanjali? And you mentioned as well in your writing ideas of ahimsa, particularly ahimsa and aparigraha. And that seems relevant. And that seems a relevant, kind of instruction towards some kind of care of the earth. But yet again, we don't see that precedent necessarily taken into practice, into what we're doing. So, do you want to speak a little bit more about that and how we might weave in the Yoga Sutras, which is a popular text, to some kind of responsibility there?
Yeah, I'll speak to the sadhana that we learned back in the day. And yes, it included asana and pranayama. But our foundational touch point every week was in sequence, one after another, sometimes paired together, would be the yamas and the niyamas. And by committing to a vegetarian, ahimsa-inspired lifestyle, by taking that simple step, a person in the developed world has made the most significant environmental commitment that any human being can take. By reducing the simple consumption of meat, so much water is saved. So much land can be restored. And this was a practice, the first practice that I learned. I was actually a student up at Buffalo, and I learned of my teacher through a philosophy class with a young woman who had been part of the ashram in high school. And she said, "Oh, I got my weekly yoga lesson in the mail." And I said, "Oh, tell me." She said, the first time I actually heard it spoken, I had read the word here and there, but she said, ahimsa. And this week I have to do nonviolence, which means that, and this was quite sort of like a treasure hunt. We used to cook together, a small group of first-year students, and we, of course, as teenagers, loved our cookies, but we had to read carefully the label and make sure that we found the cookies without any eggs. And that sort of set me off on a lifetime commitment. And in our community for 25 years, we operated a restaurant called Santosha Vegetarian Dining. And this was a grand social experiment, but it was the only restaurant of its sort on Long Island, Nassau, Suffolk counties, and it transformed us. Restaurant work is very, very difficult work. Small business management is, again, its own challenge. But this was our way of giving a face to ahimsa in the world. She, Gurani Anjali Inti, grew up in India in the 1940s. And she was part of that nationwide what became the nation, undoing the effects of British colonialism. And in those standing up gatherings that inspired really the revolution, if we will, the second yama, Satya, was at the core. And Satyagraha means holding to truth, speaking truth to power. And environmentally, she translated that into narratives of observation. And I remember one time she came into the ashram, which was a studio loft, part of an old barn, still on Merrick Road, South Shore of Long Island, a humble place. And she said, I was out with my kids. She had raised 3 kids. I was out with my kids, and I saw this football field lit up so brightly. And she said, that's a problem. A fully lit athletic field robs the power of the sun. And if we think about that simple observation, and this is speaking truth, that our biosystem gets thrown off by all the grandness of artificial lights. And she grew up in a Calcutta that had no electricity. Like my father grew up in rural Canada without any electricity. That's number one, our biosystem. But number two is that what's the cost of lighting that field? And the cost is burned fossil fuels. And that's a problem. And she spoke that truth. She never drove a car a day in her life. And again, just think of restraining oneself from that. And we're doing all these fancy gizmo now. My wife, we have electric cars here, and we're doing our best, but we're still, guzzlers in terms of energy. And she pointed that problem. The third great yama is asteya. And that means don't take what does not belong to you. Guru Ma's lifestyle, and I've asked this question of great souls all throughout India. And I remember sitting with Acharya Tulsi, who was a colleague of Gandhi, a very young man at the time. And I asked him the environmental question, and he just smiled. And he said, just look at me. And he had so little. Acharya Tulsi, a very outspoken advocate of integrating the Jain vows, which are identical with the yoga vows, into business practices, into everyday life. And he said, look, I have one change of clothes. I have this satchel that has small books, and in order to read the books, you need a magnifying glass. And I have a bowl in which I receive the food that's given to me, but I never cook. I don't have a kitchen. I just toilet in the field. And it just was breathtaking to just see a life fully committed to all 5 vows of brahmacharya, remaining without children, of a parigraha, of minimizing one's possessions. And what he put forward, and what our own Guru Ma also embodied, was a radically environmental lifestyle that emphasizes connectivity with positivity over defining oneself through possessions. And that's golden.
It's really interesting to hear the way you describe things, and it seems so obvious, but yet again, I mean, the practices can often be seen as a personal manifesto for self-inquiry, self-understanding, liberation, whatever else you want to call it. I mean, the way you translate it is that there's a definite social ethical commitment, which is certainly in line with the yamas niyamas of Patanjali. But Yeah, and it's unarguably the case. I mean, would you say that people are very interested in diet now? Would you suggest that the vegetarian diet is the pillar of yoga? I mean, I know Edwin's very staunchly and controversially adamant that you cannot practice yoga without being a vegetarian. I mean, don't want to put words in your mouth, but I mean, people argue the opposite these days. I'd say increasingly so. We have a less and less vegetarianism within the practice of yoga asana. When I started out, if you mentioned you ate meat, it was very much a controversial, very controversial. Now I'd say more and more people are saying, well, I can practice asana, I can eat meat, and I can, indulge in regular life as well.
Yeah, it's also interesting because Indian culture and traditions are capacious. And in the Mahabharata itself, it says, yeah, if you're going to go fight and kill people, you should have some meat. And there are passages that extol the power-giving benefits of eating animal flesh. But it also says right next to it, Ahimsa Parama Dharma, so that Ahimsa, in fact, is the highest Dharma. So there's a reciprocity, a give and take, room for many perspectives and many practices. So with this way of certainty, there can be a little bit of rigidity, and when one looks even at the grammar of the Sanskrit language, one sees that there's every single verb has the option of being phrased within what is called the optative. So this says, well, it could be that whatever it is that you want to do could be done. And then there's the silent example that extends into the Niyamas, the silent example of saying that, yeah, keep yourself tidy. The silent example of be cheerful. And this was one of our favorites in the ashram, and really, I think, life-building and life-giving. So the first of these niyamas is shaucha, purity. The second, santosha, the name of our restaurant, happiness and contentment. And then the third is this, there's really no way to translate it except to tell story. But the third is tapas. And once a week, and I've been at this for decades now, you can see my wizened face, but weekly fast, a juice fast, an herb tea fast.
Oh, right.
And think of how much resource has been saved if you only eat 6 days a week. And in 7 years, you have fasted a year. And now I've been doing this for 50 years, so I have fasted for 7 years. I mean, it's not something to
amazing if you
with.
think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's that much food that's been saved. And of course, there's all this research now on the benefits of intermittent fasting. And then to be silent, another very, very powerful practice, and to refrain from using your voice for a period of time every week. Very important. And then svadhyaya, this reflection on scripture, and then the quiet that comes, whatever scripture one chooses to read. And then Ishvara Pranidhana, this sense of pranidhana, of dedicating oneself to a higher vision. Ishvara. And I recently had a little bit of an internet exchange on this topic, and there will be some that say, oh yeah, Jesus is the only God, or oh yeah, Krishna is the best, or oh yeah, Shivoham. But when my colleague at the ashram, Karan Dukas, asked Guru Ma, what is this thing called Ishvara Pranidhana? And she became very quiet. And then Guru Ma responded, and she said, the true way, and again, true way, one way, to understand Ishvara Pranidhana is to get up every morning and watch the sun rise. And if you do this for a full year, then you will understand Ishvara Pranidhana. And of course, this was not a luxury in India because the day begins when there's no electricity, when the sun rises. And I just love those moments in India, seeing the villages awaken and seeing the city come to life as that sun makes its presence known.
Fantastic. I mean, it's just such a more integrated view on yoga and spirituality than just practicing asana in your bedroom or something, you know. And it makes sense if you read carefully that there is a sense of responsibility, I think, that comes in the, in between Patanjali's words. Now I wanted also to talk to you particularly about your experiences in India and in the Swastigram ashram of that was started by Vandana Shiva. I believe you spent time there, it's
right. With Vandana Shiva, we find a soulmate who has really lifted up Prakriti in a very practical manner. And by Prakriti, I'm referring to the manifest world as the gateway to community and society and to the human self. And we know from the Upanishads, a great phrase from the Upanishads sets forth Annam Brahma, that food is God and God is food. Food sustains us, food builds our bodies, food allows us to enjoy. And what we see is that with the commodification of food, meaning it has become a consumer item, there's a distance in modernity between food and the human person. Our food has become so adulterated, wrapped in plastic, shoved onto shelves, and really degraded in all senses of the word. What Vandana Shiva did was analyze data and analyze the living reality of agriculture worldwide. And if one has not done so, please go onto YouTube and put in her name, and she is interviewed in documentary after documentary. And what she has come to realize is that by vitiating food with pesticides and herbicides and petroleum-based fertilizers, that the human body itself has become damaged. And she has visited our campus many times, and if there were to be a rock star in the food world, it is Vandana Shiva.
I think it is now. I've tried to get her on this platform, but she hasn't responded yet. But we never know. I mean, she is an incredible force in India now, and and the seed saving stuff is amazing that she's doing.
A global force. And she has literally educated millions of Indian farmers about the benefits of organic agriculture. She has also successfully managed to put into place legislation throughout India that keeps out the GMO crops. There's, I believe, one exception, and I think it may be one type of mango, but she has been really successful in keeping that Frankenstein technology away. And one of her disciples in America came to our campus and shared some rather stunning data. And we're facing in America a true food crisis that expresses itself in three ways. One is obesity, another is diabetes, and another, and direct, indirect, it's very difficult to come up with a science of affirmation, but it probably is on the horizon within the next generation. But autism, okay? And what has happened in America, that a company formerly known as Monsanto developed a reciprocal technique of matching the DNA of plants with certain chemicals only sold by this company. And every year, millions more of farmland are given over to this technology. That's a problem. And it is mainly employed for a crop heavily subsidized by the US government, corn. And out of this corn now comes this substance called high fructose corn syrup that pervades almost every food. And as this one researcher shared, who himself was so ill, and he had a great story where he had a totally non-reflective diet. He would just eat all manner of junk food. And one day he was out in his New England backyard, and he sort of got in the habit of peeing on the grass. And this is a luxury of those of us who live in places where you have a little bit of privacy, or in India, no privacy. Everybody just pees on the street anyway.
Just do it together. Yeah.
Little fraternal activity there. But what happened is that he noticed that wherever he peed, and I actually saw this with my own dog, and I had to change my dog's diet, that where he peed, the grass died. And I went to my vet and I said, "What's going on with my dog?" And he said, "What are you feeding it?" And we changed, and it all got better. And this gentleman said, "I need to change." And he stopped eating that junk food. And he changed his body and actually improved his health. But the data that he shared was that in the late 90s, when this technology went into place, he did a parallel graph, and he showed more GMO, and more diabetes, more obesity. The majority population in the United States is now obese. It's absurd. And more autism. And what we're also seeing now, and I think that this is part of the bleed over of plastics, which are endocrine disruptors, and the micromolecules that are suffusing your everyday citizen's body in America, just stunning gender dysmorphia. And this was well documented in frogs with their genitalia, as they were trying to thrive in effluent from sewage systems that are just suffused with plastics and microplastics. And it's deeply concerning in terms of human biology. Right. And we talk about climate change. I think climate change is a big problem, and we're talking about it at peril of ignoring this other biochange that Vandana Shiva has anticipated and has protected India in her best way possible. And I remember many years ago, I've been in relationship with her work and her as a person for now decades, and some years ago undertook, in the spirit of my weekly fast, undertook a high fructose corn syrup fast. And just as we read those labels to make sure that we could find the cookies that did not have any eggs in them, so also, I'm not alone in this, but there are in fact major corporations that are committed to not including high fructose corn syrup in their products, entire stores. And I'll just put a shout out to Trader Joe, which has now sort of gone global, but it started here in Southern California. And they refuse to have any product labeled with their name that includes high fructose corn syrup. So this is an unheralded crisis that needs to be attended to.
Firstly, a silly and simple question. Why, or did I miss it, why is this high fructose corn syrup in everything? Like, is it a byproduct of something? Did you mention that? Why? Because I know it's the case in the US, but why? Like, we don't have it here. We don't have a problem with this corn syrup here so much, you know? Why is it endemic there?
Because of the power of the corporations. And the corporations have not only the food corporations, which are massive, massive conglomerates, have not only bought into the pesticides and fertilizers, but they've also, through the rollout and the very successful rollout of processed foods, have bought into the research that says if you put this into your food, whatever the food is, people will eat more of it because the high fructose corn syrup does not have that turn-off neuroreceptor. And I remember there was this one drink that I loved, and I would just guzzle it. And again, totally non-alcoholic. I haven't had alcohol since I was 17 years old, maybe 18. But what? And again, I haven't really ever had a weight issue. But for people who are just nibbling and drinking these things that are suffused with high fructose corn syrup, they literally do not know when to stop. Right. Normal, unadulterated food is symbiotic with human need, but these Frankenstein foods have been engineered so that you will take more and more and more. And with the industrialization of agriculture, it is now cheap. Okay, I remember the realization that in India, before the modernization of the economy, that more than 50% of household income went for the purchase of food that then one prepared. And every food encounter, which would be a daily encounter when you went down as the vegetable hawker is coming down the street, and you would think about what you want to eat, and you would go to the market. There would be no packaging. The spices would be, just everything with an immediacy. And as the modern world industrialized agriculture and packaged the food and prepared the food and processed the food, that intimacy with food was lost. And food for most Americans, a very tiny percentage of the household budget.
The other question I wanted to ask you is just to expand your comment on nanoplastics, because you do kind of, and what I've read, talk about them a lot, and I didn't understand until reading your work how destructive they are to the human system, because they're so small that they actually kind of permeate into the intestines and into the into the tissue. So if you just want to just go over that again, because I think it's a salient point, and as you mentioned, I think Vandana Shiva has done a lot to kind of get that single-use bags, plastic bags that we were seeing more and more in India, right? To get that stopped or reverse that idea, right?
I was in India on a Fulbright Nehru Fellowship in 2019 and left literally on March 13th, 2020, and then came home and the whole world closed. In California, we went under complete isolation on March 15th, so that was quite a moment. And I sort of dodged a lot of the untoward consequences of the pandemic. And when I was in India in 2019, there was a dissemination of knowledge about three very important environmental moments and political moments. One was the celebration of the sesquicentenary, the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, and reminders in the press again and again and again of his great work of undoing colonialism, and reminders of the Great Three, which are Ahimsa, Satya, and Aparigraha. That was the Gandhian remembrance. Second, there was a national move to ban single-use plastics. And the mainstream media went directly to the scientists. And right on the front page were scientific reasons to abstain from the use of plastics. Now, when a visitor arrives in India, that person is quite often overwhelmed with the sight and the smell of garbage, of trash. And in traditional times, that garbage and trash would have been made out of banana leaves and would have been biodegradable. And the food scraps would be sort of left for the pigs and for the cows to ingest, and, sort of teeming with life in every way. And even as early as my first visit to India in 1981, there was a very visible presence of lots and lots and lots of plastic. And polymer technology is prevalent throughout India, and unlike other, quote, undeveloped or developing nations, India has this really built out industrial structure. And it was scary because plastic bags were just flying through the air. And then one by one, starting with Tamil Nadu in the south, and now eventually the whole country, there was a major educational campaign. Another problem is that these plastic bags were being eaten by cows. And they were blocking the digestive system. It was really tragic. So that visual combined with this science, and India, of course, has some of the very top scientists in the world who have done amazing, literally granular research on the microbial-like nature of plastic as it goes down to the molecular level, that this was fully reported out. And I have yet to see, aside from sort of a radical editorial in progressive newspapers, once in a while will, say something. But that awareness of plastic, a very, very important piece of the news. And then another thing is that India is a land of festivals, and virtually every month there are holidays, there's days off from school, and there are large street celebrations. In August, the celebration of Ganesh in Maharashtra. In October, the celebration of the goddess, particularly in Calcutta. These big public shrines will be erected in the middle of the street, and these grand statues will be decorated and honored and made out of clay, but unfortunately painted. And while I was in Delhi in the fall, which was festival season, particularly for Durga Puja, and we went over to the Bengali neighborhood of Delhi and saw these just magnificent spectacle celebrations of the power and the presence of the goddess. And then, rather than taking her, as had always been the case, to the river to let the clay melt back into the flow of, in the case of Delhi, the Yamuna, but whatever local river or stream, because of the heavy metals involved with the paint, now those statues must be immersed and melted within swimming pool-like structures And then that water has to be processed and cleansed before it can be returned to the river. So that's a very ritually connected form of environmentalism that is probably unique to India. But I know that, for instance, in Taipei, in Taiwan, the greatest single source of pollution is the fires that are burnt to accompany the departed ancestors as they rise up into heaven. And they've had to do a major rethinking of that everyday occurrence because of the air pollution that it creates. So that was another very local instance of environmental application through conscientization, through being made aware.
Yeah.
And there are just a myriad of different examples of that sort.
I think it's easier in a way to, I mean, because we're talking about India and the problems of nanoplastics, etc. in India, but we, obviously there's just a bit more out in the open there. It's not like they are more, we definitely don't want to suggest that India is somewhat worse environmentally than the West. It's just that their problems are more on show in the open, whereas we clean it all away in big garbage cans and take it and chuck it in another country or burn it in our own, so you just don't. But in that sense, also, having it out in the open gives the immediate kind of, challenge to addressing it, which is not so, we do all kinds of things in these countries and consider ourselves, kind of ethically, environmental, etc., because we don't see the consequences of our choices, right? Everything is so sanitized, from the packages of the meat in the chillers, in the foods in the supermarkets to, the lighting or the garbage or everything, you just don't have the immediate. Whereas in India, there's a little bit more of a kind of clear connection. Okay, that bag in the street, that plastic bag is being munched by a cow now. That's clear. We don't see that so much. In terms of when we throw away our trash, probably it's munched by all kinds of animals as well. But you don't see that kind of connection so clearly. So in a way, it's they're in a great position to really lead the way. In environmentalism there. And just to wrap up this interview, though, Chris, I wonder if you could just say a few things on how we could bring this awareness and interest in involving ourselves more sustainably and consciously with the earth into our practices. I mean, I'm thinking, for one silly small example, the food prayer, the I am food. I can't remember the rest of it, but that's one thing that I was taught years ago, and I said it for a while. I have to admit, I've dropped off the bandwagon recently, hence I can't remember it. But that definitely gave the awareness that I was eating. That me and my wife made the food. We sat down, we gave thanks to the food, right? And there was a consciousness. There was a consciousness about that whole process, and about that whole ritual. Yeah. You talked of rituals earlier. Yeah, just running. I mean, what other things that could turn us on to just being more conscious in the world, and take our yoga out rather than have this whole kind of insular, kind of rather increasingly narcissistic approach to the yoga.
Yeah, we've been teaching yoga at my university since even long before I arrived almost 40 years ago. And what we've now done, we have a Master of Arts in Yoga Studies, and one of the opportunities given to our graduate students is to teach a supervised once-a-week yoga class for credit to undergraduates. And the undergraduates, these are the teenagers who have grown up in this very confusing environment, who are hearing all the stories of the difficulties of what the generations before have left as their legacy. And what they need is techniques to reconnect with nature. They need techniques that will give them hope to help reduce their anxiety, their states of depression, and their stress. And yes, they participate in the breathing and in the movement, but we build into these hour-long yoga classes reflection, and reflection on the great elements of earth, water, fire, air, space, but also reflection on ahimsa, nonviolence, satya, truth, and so on. And they are asked to journal every day and to think about, how can I make my life a little bit more gentle? How can I become a little bit more truthful? How can I honestly engage with the world? And what can I do to lighten my ecological footprint? And we've been doing this for many, many, many years, and we have data. And the data reveals that of all of the aspects of yoga, this philosophical part is the most transforming. And we're right now at the end of the semester, and it's just so heartwarming to see the student comments as they write their appreciation. A, you really care about me, and B, I have something that I know how to do. Yeah. And it's very simple. Watch the sunrise, watch the sunset, observe your food, think about your food, and love the earth.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a great place to end. I think if I reflect back to my start of yoga, asana journey, really the biggest change was the diet. Right? I heard the stuff, which was talked about a lot at the start, eating well, eating naturally, eating healthily, organic, which wasn't part of my upbringing, I'll tell you that, and I changed to a vegetarian diet. I started looking at the ingredients on the back of packets. And I tell you what happened. It's not just the light ecosystem footprint that we talk about so much now, but it's the connection back to the ecosystem, right? So, and that, as you talk, makes me remember that the biggest shift in my life before and after yoga was actually connection back to the environment. In a bigger, in the greatest sense, in the most general sense, connection of myself back to the outside. And I think, basically the earth. And I think that's what young people particularly, younger than us, younger than me now, and you, lack now, as I'm not young anymore, that we lack the, this connection to anything outside ourselves. We're living in sterile boxes, eating food we don't know anything about, How can you enjoy a meal when you know nothing about the person that cooked it, anything, whether it's ever seen the light of day, where it came from, It's just tragic. And I think yoga, for me, that's been the biggest journey of connection back to the outside world, I suppose, and using it for a greater consciousness in the way that, in terms of that connectedness. So, thank you for reminding our listeners and me also, and the importance of doing that. And that's wonderful. Thank you. It's been a wonderful chat, and I hope people take on board some ideas. And I don't know, Krista, where can people find you? If they want to read more about this, would you recommend anything particular, or is there any work that you can reference people to look at? Or you mentioned Vandana Shiva, you can look her up.
There's plenty of published literature out there that I've put out in the world. I recently did a book called Living Landscapes. A copy is on its way to you, Adam. Living Landscapes, Meditations on the Five Elements in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain Yogas. And it actually includes an appendix for a daily integrated asana and pranayama practice that gives gateways into connecting with these, what they're called as tattvas, all 25 of them, as well as the cultivation of the bhavas, the emotional states of being that define who we present ourselves to be within the world, and consequently how the world responds to us. So my full name is important. It's Christopher Key Chapple. And if you Google that, eventually you will find, a university webpage. There's a really lame Wikipedia page on me. And I think my students and staff maintain something of an Instagram and presence for the yoga studies programs, and they actually do the social media stuff. So not that difficult. And I look forward to hearing. I'm teaching here, there, and a lot of different places on the internet, including the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. I have a course there called Hinduism, Yoga, and Ecology. And we go through the literature, we go through these various practices, and then the Yoga Studies page for the Master of Arts in Yoga Studies includes a YouTube channel. And there's this one segment where I'm out here in the California sunrise and leading people through the 5-element meditations. So, yeah, it's possible.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on, Chris. And
great.
I'm sure that this is going to be a fantastically well-received and very important addition to Keen on Yoga. So please leave your comments in the question box and let us know what you think. Thank you, Chris, again. Thank you.
Thank you.